Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, Election Day, November 5th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, how the candidates are spending Election Day, plus what could ultimately decide today's outcome. And we look back at the musical legacy of Quincy Jones. After months of deciphering polls and breaking down the candidates' messages on the campaign trail, Election Day is finally here. Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris closed her campaign with an election eve rally at the Philadelphia Museum of Art after a day of stops across the major battleground state of Pennsylvania. She called on Americans' sense of patriotism, imploring them to fight for ideals at the final rally of her fast-track presidential campaign. Republican nominee Donald Trump held rallies in pivotal battleground states starting in North Carolina before heading to Pennsylvania himself for two campaign stops and wrapping up the day in Michigan. At his last rally, Trump doubled down on election fraud claims, saying without evidence that Democrats would try to cheat in the 2024 election. Meanwhile, Georgia's Supreme Court yesterday canceled any late-arriving absentee ballots that a lower court judge had ordered be provided to 3,000 Cobb County voters who never received them. The ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center filed a lawsuit after the county in a 2024 battleground state announced it would be mailing thousands of absentee ballots late. Today, Kamala Harris is in Washington, D.C., and plans to mark at least part of election night at Howard University, her alma mater. Donald Trump is expected to be at Mar-a-Lago and will host a watch party at a convention center in West Palm Beach, Florida. You can follow along on usatoday.com throughout the day, and be sure to tune into The Excerpt tomorrow morning for a full recap. So what could swing the election? I caught up with USA Today White House correspondent Joey Garrison to discuss some of the 6 things he outlined. Joey, it's the big day. Thanks for hopping on.
Yeah, it is. Thanks for having me, Taylor.
So, Joey, you outlined things to watch today that could be instrumental in deciding whether Harris or Trump wins. Let's start with the gender gap. You and I have talked about this previously. What are you keeping an eye on here?
Yeah, so throughout this race, what we have seen is a historically large gap between who you are more likely to vote for based on whether you're a woman or a man. Our most recent USA Today Suffolk poll had Harris winning female voters by 17 points and Trump leading by almost equally 16 points. Now, women vote more than men historically by a small fraction larger number. So if these type of numbers hold up, that could spell good things for Kamala Harris. But on the flip side, the Trump campaign has built a large advantage with male voters that it thinks it can use to catapult Trump to win. They've been really pointing this out in the final days, calling Harris, saying that Harris has been struggling with male voters. And so how this all shakes out, the margins we're talking about could decide who wins this.
It appears Trump has been able to peel off some of the Latino and Black vote, Joey. How crucial are these voting blocks, and what do we know entering today?
Well, this is one of the ways that Trump has tried to expand his base. In the last 2 elections nationally, we've kind of seen him topping at about 47%. He's needed to find a way to expand the electorate. He's done so by targeting younger Black, younger Latino males. And the polling suggests he could, especially among Black voters, do a little bit better than he has. Biden won Black voters 92% to 8%. That's a huge margin. Now, Harris is still winning Black voters by large margins, but polling has showed it's tightened a little bit. For example, in Pennsylvania, there was a recent poll by Marist College where Harris was up among Black voters 84 to 16. Again, Trump was getting crushed by that group. But if he gets 16% among Black voters, that's a lot more than 8%. And in Michigan, Harris was leading Black voters 75% to 25%. So, that's major inroads. And it's going to be interesting tonight to look at the margins in cities heavily Black populations like Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee. Now, the Harris campaign, though, might be able to offset some of those voters drifting away by doing better in suburbs among white college-educated voters there, where it appears she might be expanding the numbers that Biden had in 2020 with the suburban college-educated white voters. This is a group that Democrats have increasingly done better with. And if Harris wins, this group of people might, again, be the reason that she would beat Trump.
Finally, Joey, let's talk about the blue wall. We've heard a lot about this in recent years. Which states are included in the so-called blue wall, and why will we be keeping such a close eye today?
Yeah, so the battleground Rust Belt states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan make up the blue wall. And I think when we're thinking about how each campaign gets the 270 electoral votes, the easiest way to think about it is starting to look at those three states first and foremost. Now, the three blue wall states have all voted as a voting bloc in every election since 1988. So that means the candidate who won one of those states won all three. That was the case in Biden when he won the election in 2020. It was also the case in Trump when he flipped what had historically been three Democratic strongholds to the Republican column in 2016. So if Harris were to win all three, then she will be the election winner, assuming she also wins Nebraska's second congressional district, and as long as she wins the other states in which she's heavily favored. So that's kind of the clearest path for a Harris victory, I would argue. Now, on the flip side, if Trump were to win one of these three blue wall states, particularly Pennsylvania, then all he has to do is piece together a couple of Sunbelt states, and these include Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, and Nevada. He would just need to win a couple of those with that win in order to get 270. Harris, if she were to win Michigan, win Wisconsin, but lose Pennsylvania, she's all of a sudden going to have to win a combination of either Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, and Nevada, two of those states in order to offset those 19 electoral votes in Pennsylvania. So I think the way we're going to structure this and we're going to start learning, who's winning each state, and it could take a day or two because some of these ballots are going to be counted through the night, particularly in Pennsylvania. But as you start piecing this together, I mean, I think the easiest way and the most viable way for Harris to win is keeping together that blue wall, whereas Trump needs to ding it in some way, whether that's a pickup in Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin.
All right. Joey Garrison is a White House correspondent with USA Today. Joey, I appreciate the breakdown, and good luck the rest of the day.
Hey, thank you very much. You have a good day.
You can find Joey's full piece with a link in today's show notes. Donald Trump is near the start of a new presidency or the beginning of a post-campaign career that could be filled with prosecutions, lawsuits, legal expenses, and political recriminations. The next presidential administration will look different depending on who wins today, but some things are likely to hold true either way. Trump's imprint on American political life has been profound. Some of the discord, controversy, and political realignment he has brought in could fade if he loses, but much of it could linger in some form, experts say. Win or lose, Trumpism will have a major impact on a Republican Party that is very much at a crossroads. If Trump loses, there will be a ton of hand-wringing and finger-pointing that will start immediately. That's what pollster Frank Luntz said, who has worked with Republican candidates for decades. If he wins, an even Trumpier party. You can read more about that with a link in today's show notes. Quincy Jones died Sunday at the age of 91, and he left behind an iconic music legacy. I spoke with USA Today national music writer Melissa Ruggieri for more. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on to discuss the life and legacy of Quincy Jones.
It's kind of an honor to be able to talk about Quincy Jones, actually.
Well, it's an honor to have you on to talk through this, Melissa. So I think it's impossible to discuss the musical legacy of Quincy Jones without getting into Michael Jackson, right? What was their working relationship like, and just how influential was Quincy on some of the biggest MJ hits?
Michael and Quincy met at the start of The Wiz. Quincy was producing the soundtrack to The Wiz, the movie that was sort of a takeoff of The Wizard of Oz that Michael starred in with Diana Ross. And Michael was getting ready to record his Off the Wall album, and he asked Quincy if he knew of any producers he might want to enlist to help him. Quincy was like, you know what? Why don't I just do this myself? The two of them just had this pioneering spirit, I guess, of taking all forms of music. I mean, it wasn't just pop, it wasn't just funk, it wasn't just disco, it wasn't just rock. It was all of those things. And really, up until that point in music, you really didn't hear a lot of that also coming from an artist who had primarily been an R&B soul artist, Michael, when he was with his family, with the Jacksons. So Quincy really pushed Michael also because, as everybody knows, Michael was very, very shy. Quincy just had a way of bringing out his artistic ability. And even if it meant Michael had to stand in the corner with his back to him and sing in the studio, Quincy let him be himself and do what he needed to do. And then, of course, we had this greatness that came out with Off the Wall and Thriller. The thing with Thriller, of course, was the best-selling album of all time still. It was so unprecedented in so many ways. That album only has 9 songs on it, and 7 of them were released as singles and were hits. And this is back in the days when you released one single at a time. This is not Taylor Swift dumping 20 songs from an album onto Spotify, and they're all hits. That's not how it worked back in the 80s and the 70s on the Billboard charts. And Quincy just did so many interesting things that were his ideas on the album, like bringing in Eddie Van Halen to play the guitar solo and Beat It. In Thriller, the Vincent Price spoken word part, that was Quincy as well. You look at these things now that are just ingrained in pop music history, and they wouldn't be there without Quincy Jones, really.
Melissa, another significant moment in Quincy's career came with the charity single, We Are the World. Would you just remind maybe some of our younger listeners about this song, how big it really was, and how was Quincy Jones involved here?
This is a period before you had email, before you had texting, before you had any of this. Quincy Jones and Michael being the producers and the songwriters, and Lionel Richie, they managed to get 46 musicians who were the top musicians of the day. I mean, you're talking Cyndi Lauper and Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan and Billy Joel, all to come to this one studio in LA after the American Music Awards one night and stay there for 24 hours to record We Are the World. They had gotten the idea through Lionel's manager, who had heard Band-Aid's Do They Know It's Christmas had already come out. So they had thought, you know what, maybe we should do a US version of this. And Band-Aid was, of course, a bunch of British musicians who had recorded a song. Bob Geldof was the one who spearheaded that to raise money for famine in Africa. They thought, we could do this on the US side as well, and we'll just get some of the biggest names in US pop music to do it. And that's exactly what they did. Quincy was the one who just sort of anchored the whole process. He was always very serious. He was always about getting the job done, to the point that he had put a sign over the top of the doorway of the studio that said, "Leave your ego at the door."
I love that detail of leaving your ego at the door. That's fantastic. You mentioned The Wiz, Melissa. He did the soundtrack for this film. He had influence really across the movie business. How did he get involved with films, and what did this part of his life and career look like?
The first film that he scored was in 1964. It was Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker. That was one of the first times that a Black artist had actually scored a film. There are a lot of firsts in Jones's life, especially being a Black musician and a Black producer. And he was the head of a record label for a while, and that was a first at the time as well. If you do look at the scope of his career, film scores were a big part of it. He did the score for The Color Purple, a bunch of stuff that he did throughout his career that touched so many different genres. And that's the thing. I mean, he grew up as a fan of jazz, but yet was doing all this with The Wiz was a primarily, funk pop type of situation, and The Color Purple and E.T. He worked with John Williams on scoring the storybook that went along with E.T. So Michael Jackson did the narration and Quincy did the music. So he always had his hand in something. Something else that I think people should realize is just the length of his career, because as recently as 2023, he won his 28th Grammy. He factored in a Grammy for Harry Styles' Harry's House album, which won Album of the Year. And because one of the tracks on Harry Styles' album is called Daydreaming, it samples a song by the Brothers Johnson that Quincy Jones wrote back in the 70s. So even with someone as contemporary as Harry Styles, you're still seeing these connections to things that Quincy Jones had a hand in.
Beautiful. Well said, Melissa. Melissa Ruggieri is USA Today's national music writer, bringing some great perspective and insight into the life and legacy of Quincy Jones. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.